Teaching someone else how to do something is not only helpful to the person receiving the instruction, but it also helps you as well. Here's what I mean. When you understand how to do a thing, you don't always know why it makes sense to you. You understand enough to accomplish the task and to make it work. But there is no accounting for which variables unique to you allowed for that thing to be accomplished. It could be some unrelated skill you had from a sport or something your mother thought important that she passed on to you. At the end of the day, you cannot isolate all of the unique pieces of life that made you into the person you are today. The person who was able to accomplish this particular task. And yet, when you sit down to instruct someone to teach them about this thing, whatever it might be, you are immediately struck with the full scope and scale of the task at hand. You might find that you have little trouble helping another with the task, but in all likelihood, you will discover that the way you approached it, the exact precise way you went about it, will not work for this person in the same way that it worked for you. So what happens when you endeavor to teach them anyway? You learn how you learn. You learn how others learn, and you gain a much more full sense of understanding of the topic at hand. This is all a long-winded way of introducing the topic of this week's episode, that teaching someone how to draw, how to paint, teaching anything about art will make you a better artist. Let's dive in. Like I mentioned in the little anecdote at the beginning of the episode, this applies to a great many things. If you are teaching anything, it basically requires you to look at the topic from several different angles. I had a boss at one point who used to say that the only way to make sure you actually understand something completely is to teach it. I worked as a teacher for many years, and this principle, my boss, used this strategy with students frequently. Taking the students who finished quickly, who said repeatedly, "I've got this," and then gave them the responsibility of teaching a component to their peers. Sometimes this happened on a small scale, and sometimes it would involve teaching the entire class for several minutes. What happened, of course, is that they had to think through things differently, take questions from their peers that they had never considered, and in almost all cases, those students walked away understanding that topic better than they had before. And this goes for both sides of the equation. The student who presented had to answer questions and think about things differently so they walk away with a better understanding. But frankly, the students in the rest of the class receiving that piece of instruction from a secondary perspective, not just the teacher, but one of their own, was always beneficial to the students. I have another friend who's a math teacher who adopted this methodology for geometry, where each student would take on one of the pieces and describe it and teach it to the class. The teacher, of course, would always watch, make sure that the information that was being disseminated was correct, and then would follow it up if need be. Frequently, though, the students would put so much time and effort into understanding their unique component that they would do a wonderful job. And the teacher then was more of an administrator of the situation, ensuring that everything happened the way that it should. Oh, sure, he met with them in between classes and during class to make sure that the information they had was good, so they would be set up for success when it came to these presentations. But the act of teaching others helped each of those students understand it more fully. When I taught, I found this too. Certain drawing concepts were fairly easy for me to wrap my head around when I was young. But one that gave other people a hard time whilst being fairly logical to me was perspective drawing. I remember learning about drawing in perspective in 7th grade. If I remember correctly, it was our math teacher for some reason who started walking us through this and how it functioned. He lined out all of the rulers and taught us about vanishing points, worked with parallel lines, and helped us to understand the difference between 1 and 2-point perspective. Now, I am a fairly logical and linear thinker, and for me, it took little time to understand the base concepts, and it became a strategy I used for drawing in my free time for years. Fast forward a decade and change, and I am teaching middle school students myself. We get to the perspective unit, and I start demonstrating on the whiteboard as best as I can remember that I was taught. As a little aside here, this is just generally how we as humans do things. If you were taught how to do a thing without really thinking about it, most of the time you will just attempt to teach that thing in the same way that you were taught. Now, I think I can take 5 minutes and go through a lot of things in my life, and I'm sure you could do the same, that I was taught and taught in poor ways. We've all had bosses, parents, uncles, aunts who've walked us through things before, and when we look back on them as adults, we go, that was a really bad way to learn how to do that. But when you find yourself in a position where you have to teach, we have a tendency as humans to fall back into our instinct. And our instinct is usually made up of what we dealt with, what we endured in our life. So I lined up vanishing points and a horizon line. I showed them a couple of examples and they followed along. All went well. However, the second I give them a task without an example, 80% of the class flounders. In my confusion, I began asking questions. Why did you do this? Or why didn't you do this? In only a minute or two, I began to understand my assumptions, my natural assumptions about perspective drawing, the things that came logically to me and perhaps did not for others. This was an area that I found that I did not convey what my students needed. So I went back to the board, and something I thought would be a 15-minute lesson became several days of learning how, and more importantly, why things function the way that they do in perspective drawing. As we continued, the students grew and gained confidence in their abilities. They made connections, began to help each other, and connected dots I had not seen before. But more importantly, I began to understand how important the rules are for perspective drawing, the logical components that dictate what gets lined up where and why that happens. In future years, I began showing bad examples, what happened when you don't pay attention, don't line things up correctly, don't use your ruler, and how that affects your piece. I began to see common pitfalls and choices made by each generation of students, and I was able to head those off. By introducing examples of what happens when you don't follow a rule, the students would sit there and go, oh, okay, well, I wasn't necessarily going to use my ruler for everything. I thought I could eyeball it, but that looks pretty terrible, and I don't want to do that myself. Every time I taught this unit, things turned out better. I got better at understanding what my students needed, and I got better at understanding what I knew and what I naturally assumed. My approach was swifter, and the students tasted success more quickly. But also, I became far more efficient at understanding perspective myself. When I began to take art classes again, working with three-point perspective more frequently, it came far easier than it had in the past. All that time working with students, helping them to problem solve these issues had created a well of knowledge and problem solving skills within me. Now, we don't all have a room full of young students to teach, but we do have people in our lives. Perhaps you have a child who is learning how to make their first marks on the page, maybe a younger sibling, or most likely, friends who would love to learn how to draw and paint with you, and maybe are too scared or feel like they don't have the skill or talent to do so. Taking the time to teach in any of these situations is going to be a wonderful benefit for you, a wonderful opportunity for you to help others, and to gain a greater and further understanding of your medium. After all, you tend to think a lot more about how you hold your pencil or brush when you have to explain it to a toddler, when you have to describe why you can't push the paintbrush away from you because the bristles will splay out and get destroyed. These are things that maybe are instinctive for you, but they're not instinctive for everyone. And when you understand fundamental components like that at a really base level, it just improves everything with your artistic practice. This also applies to any artistic community you belong to, and any kind of casual critique you can give or you can receive. When you evaluate others' work, it helps you to see potential issues and pitfalls in your own. Working with a small community is so beneficial to your artistic growth. And I know it can be a little bit nerve-wracking to throw your art up and have other people take a look at it. We all get that. We've all been there. The people in your life who share their art willingly, who don't seem like they're afraid, there might be just something strange about them, but the overwhelming likelihood is they've just done it enough. They've gotten over that initial hurdle of the awkwardness, and now it's not as big a deal. But I can pretty much guarantee that it was a big deal for them at some point. It was for almost all of us. I still get nervous about showing certain things. There are kinds of forms of art that I feel pretty comfortable with and I can put on display. I have work in a gallery right now. I'm fortunate enough to be in that position. But there are lots of things in my sketchbooks where I feel nervous about showing them to people. So if you feel the same, you're not weird or strange or dumb. It's just part of being a human and part of being an artist. It requires a little bit of vulnerability to show other people your work, so don't fret if that feels a little bit strange to you. And this is a good opportunity to mention that we do have a Discord server for this channel. It's a pretty nice little community where we get a chance to share our work with others, to see what others are working on, and to try to work through some of those pieces. But again, as to the topic of this particular podcast, you could have the opportunity to help other people, people who are younger artists than you. Even if you haven't been at it very long, you have good human eyes, and you can start recognizing some things that are good, some things that are bad, some things that are just in need of a little bit more attention. And that benefit to you and to the community is worth looking into. So if you are looking for an artistic community, I would encourage you to check out our Discord server. All right, let's start going over some of the reasons why teaching others how to make art will, in turn, make you a better artist. And I want to start with foundational reinforcement. We all hear about the fundamentals of art, all the time it seems. These fundamentals are foundational for our work, and often as we move along in our journey, we can stray from them. When you sit down to work with new artists, you are forced to analyze your own skills, your own understanding of these basic concepts, and figure out the best way to describe them, the best way to get everything across. Think about something as simple as light. We all basically have an understanding of light and how it affects things, that it makes certain things brighter and certain things darker. But in every piece of art that you work on, light plays some role. Even if you're working on inking, you're working on just line art or a logo design, you're really thinking about light in some capacity. Because even if that thing is just alluding to three-dimensional shape, light is still a factor because it influences everything we see. Now, granted, there might be a couple random esoteric areas of art that are not going to involve much in the way of light, but almost all forms of drawing will. And light is complicated. When you or I, who maybe have been doing this for a long time, shade a sphere or an apple or some pretty simple structure, we can do that probably without thinking about it. We can do it by instinct. We've maybe done it so many times that it's just a normal thing for us. But when you have to describe why the cast shadow grows when the light source adjusts its angle, when you have to describe the difference between light at sunset and sunrise, when you have to talk about diffused light versus direct light, these are complicated things. And the more time you invest into them, the more time you invest into describing and teaching another, the better understanding you have about that fundamental. The reality is, as you move into any kind of proficiency with a skill, you're always going to trend towards specific things. And sometimes those specific things are not the best way to do it. They're just a way that you've memorized. We fall into this a lot when it comes to art style. There are beautiful, wonderful pieces of art style, but sometimes some pieces of our art styles are just crutches. They're easier ways to show hands, easier ways to show faces. I mean, I could even talk about it with the way that I'm drawing the little girl on top of this dragon in this particular piece. I chose to illustrate a girl like this, where she's very cartoony, because it's easier for me. I know it. I'm able to achieve what I want inside of a couple minutes of sketching, and then I'm allowed to go through the piece, because what I really want to do is spend all that time working on the dragon and all of the hatching. The dragon, on the other hand, looks way more realistic than the little girl. It's a stylistic clash, perhaps, but I don't think it will really matter. The thing that I'm pointing at here is that even me, who's talking about these things, who's very aware of these things, I research them, I write about them, and I think about them constantly, I do this too. Almost all of us do. And style is usually what we fall into. And so when you start working with younger artists, when you start teaching other people about things that you understand better than they do, you always end up going back to some of the more basic components of your art. And that review is really, really good for us, and we need it. And sometimes teaching is just the most effective way to pull ourselves back into it. Another really lovely thing that teaching others does for us is it identifies gaps in our knowledge. Though it's not fun to admit, we all have gaps in our knowledge base. Few things allow us to find these gaps faster than working with a younger artist who needs our help and who asks questions that we find we can't answer in the moment. Whatever you focus on as an artist tends to leave blind spots. This is actually the logical reason behind why so many art teachers are upset when their students focus on drawing anime or manga. Their fear is that you as a student will focus too much on a single thing to the detriment of everything else. While this concern might be overhyped, there is some reality to it. If all you draw is the same thing all the time, you are not going to hone your skills anywhere near as much as you would if you diversified. So if you draw only things from anime, that's probably fine as long as that's all that you want to draw at that moment or in the near future. I give those caveats because it's not like those skills won't transfer to other things. They certainly will, but they won't transfer as efficiently to everything. And maybe if you're 16, 17, 18, 65 years old and you really love anime and manga and that is your sole desire when it comes to your art, then that's probably fine. I still think there's a really good case to be made that the anime and manga artists that you enjoy so much have learned how to do what they do by focusing on things outside of that realm. Anime is, after all, a cartoon, a simplification of a particular thing in real life. And the people who originally designed the anime and manga styles that we love did so by looking at real life and simplifying it. And that's what those teachers are focusing on. Now, they often do so with a level of aggression and vehemence that is not good for children and not good for young people, but most of them, I think their hearts are probably in a good place. Teaching others also promotes secondary problem solving. We tend to be creatures of habit as humans. We tend to figure out how to solve an issue and then we stick with that manner of solving it, even if there's a myriad of other ways to do so. We seem to be blind to the fact that there might be another way to do it. If you learn one way to cook a steak or make pizza, that's probably what you're going to stick with unless there's some aspect of it that you really dislike. It's inefficient. It burns your steak every other time. Then you'll probably look into something. But if you have a good method for cleaning, if you have a good method for loading the dishwasher, you have no reason innately to go and find other ways to do that thing. This, of course, does not mean that the way that you land on at the beginning isn't the best, but it also doesn't mean that it is. There's nothing about it that gives you any further context. So when you help other people, you will often find that they approach things differently than you do. And in this difference, you will often find that they conjure strategies significantly departed from your own. Sometimes these strategies are simply different, sometimes they're worse, and you get the chance to pass on what you've learned through your hard work. However, on rare and beautiful occasions, you will discover that their method is actually better than yours. This is wonderful if you're humble enough to take it in. You have the ability to learn something from your student, to learn a better way of approaching something. I actually struggled with this in my initial years of teaching. I was young and more proud than I had any business being. I was threatened by students who were getting close to my skill level, or threatened that they might surpass me. As I grew up, I realized that that is literally the goal. The goal for me was to train students who would surpass me, students who would go on to work better things than I did, who had more support than I did in my young years as an artist. My job was that of an art parent, to help others in ways I appreciated and to fill in the gaps that I had in my own artistic childhood. With this knowledge, it was exciting when students could show me easier ways to draw hands, to simplify things, or to get around difficult issues. There have actually been many times in the last couple years of teaching where I would reach out to my students about drawing specific things because it was more efficient than me going home and spending an hour or two Googling things and finding tutorials. If you have community, if you have people in your life that you can simply ask questions of, you give them the opportunity to teach you, which is good for them. You show them that you value their input, and it's less work for you. So it's a win-win-win, or however many categories there were of winning, but it is a beneficial thing across the board. This might be one of the most underrated benefits of teaching others. If you're humble, you can take in so many new things. It also gives you the opportunity to practice communicating through your work and communicating to others. Communication is quintessential to art. The goal is either to communicate something to an audience or to work through something in yourself, thus communicating that which you do not yet understand. Yes, I know that there are some people who work simply for the pleasure of working, but for the vast, absolutely vast majority of us, art is about communicating. And I would be willing to wager I could find a way to justify how those who just like mark making alone are still communicating something, but I digress. When you work with another person, you get to practice communicating, literally, as you talk to them and walk them through things, but also in the artwork itself. You get to experiment with different ways of representing the same thing, or different ways of simply talking about it. I was reminded of this morning as I had coffee with a friend, that our brains use our vocabulary in order to contextualize almost everything. The broader our vocabulary is, the better our brain does at thinking independently of functioning on its own. Our minds need words in order to actually understand. When wine experts are being trained to recognize all of the subtleties of differing wines, they are first given an immense vocabulary, a list of words and tastes to apply to the nuanced and complicated things they are just beginning to understand. As their vocabulary increases, so too does their ability to attribute the unique tastes to new and unique words. It is not a one-to-one situation, but as we accumulate words, we accumulate the ability to talk and thus understand more specifically the things we encounter. Another piece of this is simply that we are able to be more brief in our explanations. If you don't have to explain what all the terms mean concerning a particular topic, you can speak more quickly. It's part of the reason why in classes of all kinds, your teachers spend a lot of time focusing on vocabulary at the beginning. It just makes it more efficient if they're able to use the word treaty rather than explaining the definition of it every single time. If I can talk to you about contrast, about chroma or hue when I'm teaching you something about art, that's a lot more efficient than having to define those things every single time that I mention them. But this is a wonderful benefit of working with and teaching new people. Innately, you begin to learn and utilize new words, and you learn new ways of communicating. And for almost everything we do in life, communication is relevant. It's a huge part of it. In fact, for almost any job across any particular industry that you are looking to get hired, your communication skills are going to be one of the first things that's evaluated. Why? Because you're talking to people. How you hold yourself, how you present yourself, how you convey information on your resume and also in person, or whatever form the interview takes. All of those things are being used to evaluate you. So anytime you have an opportunity to practice your communicating, it will benefit you in the long run. Obviously, having the opportunity to teach other people allows you to practice your own creativity as well. When I used to design projects, my goal initially was just to occupy the students' time because I was overwhelmed with everything involved in teaching, as everyone who teaches the first time is. As I began to really delve into it and understand what my job was, that I really wanted to communicate specific things, teach the students about fundamentals so that they could construct art that they were happy with. I understood that just having the students practice all the time was really boring and it wasn't going to create an environment that they wanted to be in. So I started devising projects. I built these projects specifically to teach specific things. Obviously, if I wanted to teach a perspective unit, I could justify just spending several weeks doing nothing but drawing boxes, but that's no fun for most people. I kind of like it. But that became drawing spaceships and drawing space stations and castles and old Western towns. Things that were going to be more interesting, or at least have the opportunity to be more interesting for the normal student. I did this with everything as I started to build projects. One of my favorite projects where I would give the students a picture of bones to an animal that they didn't necessarily know, and they had to look at those bones and then create the creature that could believably have that skeletal structure. That project was about a lot of different things. It was about applying textures, thinking about what the skin, the fur, the scales might look like. But it was also about the analyzing of that form, the thing that they'd been giving. And it also gave them an opportunity to think about the context. When they looked at the teeth, the body, the claws of that creature, they would have to analyze, well, how big does this thing look like it is? What does it look like it eats? Is it aquatic? Is it not aquatic? What kind of features can I imply from the things that I'm seeing? This project was fun and adventurous and imaginative, but it was designed from a perspective of these are the things that I need to get across to the students. These are the things that I need to teach them. And anytime you try to teach people, it forces you to be a little bit creative. If you're doing a good job with it, I guess you could just throw them the most meager bone possible, but that's boring, and that's not why we're here. Teaching allowed me to come up with really interesting and creative ways to solve these problems, to get things across to students. And I think that it's a lovely benefit, something I'm still benefiting from today. Teaching others also allows for you to build up your confidence. Teaching can be hard, just like art is. The more you do it, or the more you do it well, I suppose I should say, the more you understand that you can do it. Anytime you learn to do a new thing well, you build confidence in your ability to take on new things and to grow. In this same train of thought, you may be insecure about your artistic abilities, your ability to help someone new at the craft. The reality is, the skill of making art and the skill of teaching art are quite different from one another. Yes, you have to have some amount of artistic skill to even begin to understand how to teach it, but they are fundamentally different skills. As you learn how to teach others, you gain confidence in a different skill set and potentially understand more about yourself in the process. This also instills a belief in you that you can take on new things. This might not extend into an artistic field necessarily for you, but you might understand that whatever job it is that you're looking at, that you're thinking about applying, that you have a dream of pursuing, well, I've taken on a lot of things that were difficult. A lot of things that didn't come natural to me at first. And you know what? I can probably take that on too. Naturally, teaching others encourages reflection. As you start to break down why you do things, as you start to teach them, inevitably you start to understand a little bit more about yourself. I think art for very many people is a wonderful way of exploring themselves, at thinking about who they are, how they ended up where they are, and why they do things the way that they do. I suppose on a surface level, this might seem very detached for an art podcast, but I think that you always benefit from understanding yourself more. When you understand your tendencies, the way that you make decisions, the reasons that you act the way you do, you can more thoroughly predict what you might do in the future, and you can plan for it. If you find that over time you have a difficult time with particular situations, you can let your friends or your partner know as you head into those, hey, this is usually difficult for me. I could use a little extra support over here. That kind of reflection is always going to benefit you. Whether the reflection is artistic or not, I think it matters little. Reflecting on who you are, why you make the decisions you make, anything along those lines is going to benefit you not only as an artist, but as a human. It can also be very validating for what you've spent time learning. There is purpose in your hard work. Not only can you make beautiful things, but you can help others learn how to do that as well. Art often gets shunned. It often gets relegated to this place, at least in the United States, of something that is only for leisure, that is purposeless, that is silly to focus on when you are an adult. But the reality is, A, none of those things are true. But the other side of it is, even if that was true, it still brings tremendous joy to people. And you have the opportunity to work through things in a way that you can't in a lot of other aspects in life. I know a lot of people in my life who got into their 50s or 60s before they actually started producing art. And it was a healing thing for them. Ways to work through the loss of loved ones or trauma that they've endured and they've held on to for ages. It is a wonderful thing for people of all ages, even if it never brings any financial benefit. I don't spend a lot of time talking on this channel about art careers and things like that. And that's predominantly because that space on this platform is really well taken care of by a lot of other people. And if that's what you're looking for, I would highly recommend looking at Mark Brené, looking at Trent Kaniga. And if I've got any others that occur to me, I will link them in the description down below because there are a lot of really, really good resources that way. Adam Duff of Lucid Pixel just occurred to me right now as well. There are a lot of resources that way. I also don't spend a lot of time there because my time as an artist has largely been spent teaching. So that is where I focus most of my time and most of my energy. But I think that art is also this wonderful, beautiful thing, even if you never make a dollar with it. If all you ever do is draw for your own benefit, for your own healing, and because it brings you joy to do so, that's relevant. That's important. That's not silly. Taking care of yourself is never a silly thing. It's always good. So it's validating for the time that you put into your art, learning how to make art when you are able to pass that on to other people. And sometimes that can make up for so much pain and blood and sweat and tears if just that one other person gets some joy from it. I'm starting to experience this in a totally new way now as my daughter, who actually turns 5 tomorrow, I'm recording this on May 9th. My daughter's birthday is May 10th. She turns 5 tomorrow. And she is getting so much joy out of learning how to draw things now, and just discovered in the last couple weeks that she can actually look at a reference rather than pull things from her memory and give new attributes to things. So as she started to draw a fish last week, she was actually looking at it and analyzing where the fins go and how they have to function. This might seem like a really elementary thing, but that's the thing, is she's not even in elementary school yet. I know that's not exactly what that word would be attributed to there, but we have to learn those things. A lot of people, when they get older and they talk about how they can't draw, what they mean is, oh, I can't pull something out of thin air. It's like, well, yeah, but most people can't. Most people have to learn how to do things. Most people study in order to know how to draw a horse or a hand or a foot or a face. Most of us can't do that just the day after we decided that we wanted to draw. So it's been really validating for me personally to spend time teaching her and not pushing her too hard, but just letting her find joy in things and doing art alongside her. Sometimes she mimics things. I've seen a lot of extra eyes and tentacles on her work because of a lot of the eldritch stuff that I produce. But she's, a little kid who's just getting a lot of joy out of her artwork right now. And it's been very validating for me to get an opportunity to work with her and teach her. And I think that actually takes me into the last thing that I want to focus on really beautifully, even though I didn't script it this way intentionally. Legacy and community. People are important. Much of the time we try to make art, it is for people. Ourselves, those we love, some random person out there who might see this painting and it might just help them get through the day. You build community if you teach well. You link yourself to another person or to a group of people. As you teach, you leave behind people in your wake who now know how to do things because you took the time to teach them. These new abilities, these new desires, new skills, they exist in part because of you. When you teach anything, you begin to leave a legacy behind. And what a wonderful gift to the world. Well, as always, thank you for listening. I hope that this podcast was beneficial to you. I hope that it might encourage you to take a little bit more time out of your very busy day and instruct some other people about the things that are important to you. If you have children, spend some time with them and just make art alongside them. And when they ask you questions, answer them. And if you don't know how, you guys can learn together. And if you have younger siblings, if you are part of an art community, if you'd like to look into the Discord community we have, all of those options are wonderful things to explore. Thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your continued support. And if you are interested in helping decide what happens in these podcasts, what random things I ramble about in the sketchbook sessions, if you'd like to see scripts and outlines while they're still in progress, you can support the channel through the Patreon link below. Any support is much appreciated, including watching this video and hanging out with me for this half hour today. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.